So I'm going to talk a bit about my experiences. I went to Nepal very rapidly after the earthquake, so I'm going to go through those experiences now. That's quite a long time ago now, so apologies to those of you who've heard all of these kind of things before. But what I'm going to move on to then is talking about some of the work that's been studied in Pakistan and India around recovering after natural disasters, recovering shelter after natural disasters, and contrast how how that applies in Nepal and whether there might be some lessons from that. It is only 20 minutes, so it's going to skate over some of this quite quickly. But just to give a taste of what it's like deploying immediately after an earthquake, this is 2 days after the earthquake. It took 24 hours to get there because of the airport being closed. And I work for CARE, as you can tell, by the way. But this was CARE's operations room, which was in the lobby because everyone was afraid about going any further into the building. But and this is Kathmandu, and quite surprising arriving in Kathmandu was just that there was very little visible damage. So in the news, there'd been all this stuff about massive damage, major events. All of our planning had been around Kathmandu being pretty much destroyed in an earthquake. And we were driving down the road from the airport and there was no damage. And actually most of the buildings looked more like this than like that. It was only when you went to the older parts of the town that you started to see damage like this in the unreinforced masonry buildings. And then when you went outside Kathmandu, a bit more rural, you started to see damage like this. So buildings still standing, but gable ends having fallen off, quite significant structural damage, probably buildings having to be demolished. And then even further out, and this is Sindhupalchok, which is the other side of Kathmandu from the epicenter, but a very badly struck area, and suddenly you start to see this really serious damage. And major landslides, so for scale, this is one of our team up here. This used to be the road to a whole region, so we had to clamber over these to go and do assessments and work out what needs there were and how many people were in need. And you can see the damage done to the landscape, and what was quite affecting was quite how palpable the fear of the land was that people were living in. They were afraid of their buildings, but they were afraid of the actual land they were walking on, and made their living off. The earthquake came at the time of harvest. This was supposed to be harvested very soon after this, and then planting was supposed to happen. All of that didn't happen, so the knock-on effect wasn't just shelter. It was also people's food security. And you can see here, these are food stores which are typically up in the loft. They were completely destroyed, full of mud as a result of the earthquake. So there was, compounding factors that made the effect of this in rural areas particularly serious. And this is you can see here, this is a village that we went to assess, and people had established their own communal shelter there, but this is an elderly couple trying to salvage the millet from the mud. From their stores. And here you can see people already trying to dig out the contents of the village shop so that they could start their livelihoods again. So people were traumatized, but immediately getting back to survival because they had no choice. And we happened to arrive there at full moon, so this was puja time. This is a 19-year-old young woman who'd actually lost her entire family in the house that you can see collapsed around her. And I'm going to talk a little bit later about gender and women's ownership rights in Nepal. And a particular issue that she was facing is that she was not going to inherit the land that she used to live on. That was going to go to an uncle. So her future was entirely in doubt, as well as having just lost her entire family. So having kind of taken stock of the situation and got an idea of what's going on, very quickly we start having to deliver some kind of aid. So food came first to the remote villages, a lot of helicopter flights back and forth. But shelter kits were then delivered. And for CARE, this meant going from an organisation which really had been a service-oriented organisation. It used to do a lot of infrastructure work, moved on to various other activities. It didn't have warehousing, didn't have offices in the right places. So a lot of the work that you do as a deployed person is immediately setting up the systems, the logistics, and all the things to actually deliver aid as quickly as possible. So here's a load of stuff sat out in the rain, and very quickly we have to start getting warehouses. You find a half-built building and finish it off quickly and use that as a warehouse. And a lot of meetings. So I put this meeting up because it's interesting. It's particularly relevant to an engineering organisation. It's a technical working group for the shelter cluster, and this was discussing both what the technical requirements were going to be for reconstruction and what agencies were going to be doing around that. Particularly interesting, there's one Nepali person in the room, only one. He's from NSET, which is a fantastic organisation in Nepal doing specialising in seismic research and retrofitting. And then a bunch of foreign aid workers, some of whom are qualified engineers and some of whom aren't. But really very difficult to get people who know what they're doing when it comes to unreinforced masonry. Some of the sleeping arrangements, the kind of, so moving around, setting up field offices. This one on the top was, we managed to get to a town in Sindhupalchok in time to Bagsi, the only building that was still standing. In order to, we rented it and put our entire staff in it. The owner of the building was downstairs and was very happy to have some income in order to use that. But a lot of sleeping in tents. And cars are quite difficult to get in Nepal, so this was my car. Not so good for going off-road, but we very quickly moved on from, because winter was coming. There was a big concern about people having a secondary emergency about in winter, it being very cold, especially in high regions. So this is the beginnings of what we called in fairly military terms a forward operating base, but we put a bunch of staff and a load of materials here in advance of the road access being cut off, so that they could have this position. They could continue operating even if road access got cut off. That's just kind of a flavour. I wanted to give that as an introduction. But what I'm actually going to talk about now is more what we're doing more than 2 years after the quake. Is it more than 2 years? No, a year and a half. Anyway, a long time after the quake. And looking at recovery and what lessons we can learn from other places. In the context of still waiting, or the vast majority of people still waiting for the government cash support that is promised to allow them to rebuild. So I'm going to skip these, I'm afraid. Sorry, these I meant to delete these and I didn't manage to. This is actually a shelter to an earlier response in Nepal. Floods in Surkhet, which is out in western Nepal in 2013. Because of the earthquake, this response was kind of forgotten. As far as I'm aware, these people are still there. They had no land. And negotiations with the government around providing land stalled when the earthquake happened. That's something that a lot of the people affected by the earthquake are also facing, because they were displaced when their land disappeared or became unsafe because of earthquakes, because of the earthquake and landslides, and as a result are kind of in limbo about where they're going to go. What we do in a lot of other locations, this is the Philippines after Typhoon Haiyan, would be helping people to do self-building. And when you have, and actually that way you can reach a much bigger scale, you can help far more people meaningfully than if we build by ourselves. That's quite easy to do when you have timber buildings. You know, the costs are lower, the technology is easier, the things you have to get people to put in place, bracing, decent connections, a well tied down roof, good foundations, are a simpler message than with a complicated stone masonry building. So it'd be very nice to take this approach in Nepal, but it's much more difficult to do successfully. Just after the Nepal earthquake, we actually did a big study of the last 15 years of shelter programs that CARE's done in India. That includes the tsunami response, but another 9 or 10 other projects, and we also looked at some Christian aid projects, and looked at the long-term outcomes of those projects and what had happened to people, between 5 and 10 years hence. And this is an example of some of the buildings. So it ranged from pretty low technology, timber frame buildings with mud rendering, to properly designed reinforced concrete buildings. And some of these have been expanded enormously. You can see the one over there. It started out looking exactly like one of the other ones. The owners have really gone to town on it. So there are a few conclusions that we drew from this. And the key one is actually, the really positive one is that the occupancy rate was high and people generally had survived and been able to survive in a dignified way. So the pure emergency response had been successful and it had met the people's urgent needs and carried on doing so, even where the buildings were intended to be temporary. But beyond that, some of the bigger things that we try to do with shelter programs, or often say that shelter programs achieve, weren't necessarily so well done. There was a huge focus on the product, and historically, the aid world has really been focused on we build things and we give them to people. That was the tsunami modality. It was largely the modality after Haiti as well, was turning up, building something. That was the assistance. There wasn't enough involvement. There wasn't enough decision-making of the actual people we were building these houses for. And a key thing, the maintenance burden is a huge deal. Some of those buildings required serious maintenance, and it wasn't planned. It wasn't thought about enough, and as a result, it was a big burden on people to keep the buildings operational, and especially where buildings are intended to be temporary, but maybe there was no plan for replacing them and people didn't have the resources to replace them. They had to carry on maintaining these. On the other hand, buildings where the maintenance was lower, so buildings, particularly concrete buildings that have been well built and were pretty durable, people had reinvested that money they normally spent on rethatching the roof or everything else in other things. Examples would be rice cookers, domestic appliances, or educating their children. So some pretty major knock-on benefits. A key lesson there being you need to think about maintenance, even if you're doing a temporary building. There wasn't really enough attention on the community aspects, and especially where we're talking about relocation, which, again, in Nepal, there are communities that will have to be relocated or even want to be relocated. Typically, where that was done, there wasn't enough effort put into making sure that those communities can access representation, can represent themselves. It's pretty much impossible to solve all the problems that exist in an NGO project. So the lesson there is you need to leave behind some of the tools so that the community can at least have a go at solving some of those problems. And those problems might be as severe as not having a water supply. So it's pretty significant things. Lessons that we see after every evaluation and the whole sector hasn't solved yet. So priorities of donors and governments being more important than the priorities of the affected people. Something to look at again and again and again, but we have to keep trying. But interesting thing, some of these buildings had withstood some pretty major natural hazards. So some pretty big typhoons had come through some of these and they'd stood up. So it shows that that technical intervention in making sure the buildings are stronger is worth doing. But the other vulnerabilities, the more social vulnerabilities, hadn't been so well addressed. So people who were disadvantaged in their communities anyway continued to be so. So key thing is, as I kind of alluded to before, it's not really appropriate to deliver buildings you call temporary without people understanding what's being delivered and without a viable plan to replace them. So there were too many cases of people having been told a building was temporary who were saying, well, what's coming next? And nobody had ever told them, and there was no plan. So they were still in the temporary buildings, and like porter cabins in schools post-war here, they're there for the long term. And actually, maybe it's more honest if we plan for that in the first place than kid ourselves that this assistance is temporary. And here, a key thing, giving property title to women, where it was done in a meaningful process, where men were involved in it and women and the whole community agreed that this is the way it should be done, it had a seriously empowering effect. Women actually felt control over assets they previously had no control over. And that's something that's very relevant to Nepal, where legally speaking, women have every right to own property, but traditionally, especially in rural areas, it's very difficult for women to inherit that property, even though they have every right to do so. The other example I'm going to go over quite quickly, 2005, there was a major earthquake in Pakistan, huge effect. We haven't done a big study of our projects there, so I've got less depth on what we did on the lessons there, but other people have, and it's been very well studied. And what was interesting is there was an owner-driven reconstruction process, so not unlike the India approach that I've just talked about, where it was very top-down, it was NGO-driven. This was owner-driven reconstruction. They did their own construction, but to government-designed buildings. It was huge. 3.5 million people accommodated, major public communication training and implementation program. A lot of organizations involved, really complex coordination. You can see the type of buildings that were built, much more complicated than the timber one I started off with in the Philippines. And people built these themselves with the training that was provided. And you can see here that's a training house down there, so it was left unfinished deliberately so that people could see how to do it. There were 6 different types depending on regional construction types. And you can see here that it was staged construction, completed to plinth, completed to lintel, completed building, and it took 5 years to get to almost the same number that has been destroyed. In reality, the program kind of trickled on for another 5 years, but it was really those first 5 years when it happened. And particularly relevant is there was a Federal Relief Commission formed on the 10th of October. That's 2 days after the earthquake. So very rapid decision making, really, really quick. And that coordinated everything. It coordinated NGOs. It had aligned with the cluster system. So the government had somebody for the shelter cluster to talk to. It had somebody for the wash cluster to talk to. Something notably missing in many other responses, where government departments and the cluster system don't line up, so nobody's quite clear who they're supposed to talk to. So that's quick. There's a whole study, or several whole studies, on why that program was so successful, and it was used in that very coordination meeting I showed the photo of. We were talking about, let's try and replicate the Pakistan response in Nepal. Similar building types, similar issues. And you can see this is the kind of project that we're working on at the moment. So we have a model house there, we're doing a lot of training, but it's done in the context of not having that very strong government direction above. In Pakistan there was also accreditation. So all the houses and the training had to be accredited by the government. In Nepal that's not happening so well. So what we've actually got is much more fragmented response, where lots of organisations like CARE are doing their best, but they're doing it in isolation. So there's a lot more depth to this. So this is very much skating over the issues, but it's interesting that in Nepal it took many, many months to even have a National Reconstruction Authority put in place. And what we have is a kind of hybrid between the India-type response, where it's very NGO-driven, and the Pakistan response, where it's very government-driven, and the NGOs all are can very clearly understand what their role is, and other organisations all slot in. I don't want to pretend that the Pakistan response was perfect, but it's a very good example. So it's especially looking from the outside, because I'm an advisor, so I talk to Nepal, I'm involved with Nepal, but I'm not directly involved with the operations there. It's interesting to see how some of the lessons are learned, but some of the lessons aren't learned. And really it's quite difficult to get the balance right and avoid this kind of issue, but also avoid this. And this is an example of a project, a self-build project for somebody who didn't have the capabilities to do their own construction and couldn't finish the building, and that was the situation they're left in. So self-build really needs some serious support. So really the main lesson there is that, because we can't always expect government to give that strong support, is that as the NGO sector we have to get much, much better at supporting people to build their own houses, at giving that technical support and getting it to household level. So it can't just be at government level, it's got to be at every level. If you're interested in any more of these issues, there's a study, the India study. I've got copies of this if anyone wants to read it. That's a summary, or there's a full 120-page version if anyone wants that online. And there's an interesting thing about housing and property in Nepal. But there's a whole lot more work that we've been doing on this, but it's kind of an overview of that. So I hope it's interesting as a kind of taster. I'll leave it with that. Oh, yeah. If anyone has any questions?
Yes. We have about 10 minutes for questions. Yes.
Sorry, this might be a question that if you knew the answer might solve all the world's problems, but why do you think, what do you think it was about Pakistan that, like, so that they knew how to align with shelter and wash clusters compared to, say, the Nepalese government? I'm not absolutely sure. I don't think the studies I've read haven't really said why Pakistan was able to make that, had the knowledge to make those decisions, because before the disaster, Pakistan had a decidedly weak, it didn't have a national disaster management authority. That didn't exist. You take India, for example, it now has a very strong national disaster management authority and strong state disaster authorities. But yet, the decision-making, and this was in one of the rare periods of Pakistan being quite stable, authoritarian but stable, and the army and the government worked together, made the decisions and implemented things. I don't think that's something that is likely to happen again in Pakistan, and certainly during the 2010 floods it didn't happen. So it happened at the right time, I think, more than anything. But it really does show the importance, and India now, and that's touched upon quite a lot in this study, 15 years ago, and now India is a completely different place. The strength of the civil disaster management authority is critical. You know, having really good civil disaster management leadership that can use the army if they need to, but is in charge, really makes a huge difference. So that's a key lesson there. And we as the humanitarian sector need to fall into line really when that is in place, and we need to know what to do when it isn't. And we're pretty patchy at that.
Just intervening, I know that I was in NATO at the time. There was a significant NATO deployment into Pakistan with really heavy amounts of engineering. So whether that played a role as well.
Well, I think it's the same thing. It's all those deployments, and it wasn't just NATO. There were individual various other army deployments in. They were all welcomed and controlled and coordinated by the Pakistani army and the National Disaster Management Authority, but then it was called ERRI, the Earthquake Reconstruction Authority. But and it's interesting looking at Nepal, where the politics around the military support was much more complicated, and some of it was turned down. The Chinese, Nepal was very reluctant to have Western military going near the Chinese border. There were all sorts of issues around that. That said, it was much easier than we thought it would be, because our plan for Kathmandu being destroyed, which was what we planned the response around, and luckily wasn't the case, had anticipated major issues with the Indian and Chinese army having come into Nepal, and that didn't happen. So, military support has to be treated with caution, but if it's under support, if it's controlled by the civilian administration and coordinated properly, it's incredibly useful. Yes.
Thank you. We have a lot of questions. So take maybe a few at the same time. So one.
Oh, let me have to write them down. Does anyone want to?
Take a third. Richard. Okay.
Tom, I was just going to ask how much better prepared, if at all, the Nepalese emergency response is now for the next natural disaster of that scale as a result of what happened last year.
I'm not sure. Oh, sorry. Let me.
So if they're better prepared, there was a second question there.
I just wanted to ask.
Yeah.
You mentioned that the disaster response was quite good, but in Nepal. But what was done less well was a sort of integrating or dealing with the other factors, the land rights or the kind of longer term, more social issues, let's say. I just wondered what could have been done better by the humanitarian sector and relief workers, that foreigners that came in to the country on that, compared to, what can't you do on that level?
Now we had a third question from Richard.
Great, thanks. Probably just to echo a little bit of that question, what scope do you see for the shelter cluster, and indeed all the other clusters, given all these lessons learnt, to be much more directive at the global level to say, this is what we know, this is good practice, do it, or tell us why it won't work? So much stronger, what I call program policy leadership from the global level to say, do this, or justify why not.
Yeah.
Because we continue to not learn lessons.
So the first one, frankly, I don't know how much better the government and civil response is prepared for another emergency. My gut feeling is probably not much, because it hasn't had the time to stop and think. But what probably is much better is Nepali civil society, because they've had a crash course in how to do emergency response. They're the first responders. They were there much quicker than anyone else at getting meaningful assistance to people. And typically, most villages receive some food and pretty low quality, but still tarps from some young people in a pickup truck before any of the big agencies got to them. They'll have learnt from that, and they'd be quicker next time round, I would imagine. So I think that's probably the clear thing that would have been improved. But in terms of systemic improvement, I don't think it's there yet, but maybe it will come. And they do have a national reconstruction authority, which is a starting point, and that's something you could build off. In terms of what it's not quite the case that I meant. I didn't quite mean that the emergency response was really good, and what's happening now is not so good, because there are many flaws with the emergency response. It was an incredibly difficult place to operate, logistically difficult, politically difficult. I mean, I didn't even mention the blockade that at the Indian border that was there for months and really just stopped everything. So there's a whole bunch of. It's not very clear cut about what was good and what wasn't. I think in terms of what could have been done better, the planning could have been better around, not based on Kathmandu, because frankly we didn't know what we were doing, because we'd planned everything around Kathmandu, and we had to very quickly within a week go, oh no, it's not Kathmandu, it's outside up the mountains. And better engagement with that local capacity would have been much more effective. But on the political side, it really needs rapid decision making. It needs that to happen really quickly. In terms of the longer term, I don't think it's too late. You know, that Pakistani program took 5 years. Most reconstruction, Haiti is still rebuilding. So there's the naivety, I think, of the kind of quick response, and the stories that get told around it are that this all goes away very quickly. But reconstruction after an event like this takes years and years and years. So there's certainly scope for doing this, and I think it's important that the decision makers in Nepali government take those lessons, especially from Pakistan, but also the more social lessons from the type of work in India, because the Pakistan program didn't touch upon those issues so well, and try and incorporate them in what they do. And I think a key lesson for humanitarian programs, and I think for me personally as well, is don't be so distrustful of the administration there. We have a tendency. We work in so many awful places where the government can't be trusted, that we have a tendency to kind of ascribe that to every government, and be very reluctant to work with government because it affects our neutrality and independence, and I think we have to be a bit less defensive about some of those things. That's something I think should have been done differently. In terms of scope for cluster to be more directive, I think it should be. I think to do that properly, it needs to be better resourced, because I mean, I mentioned that cluster meeting without having the right expertise in the room. The cluster can't be directed if it doesn't have the expertise. It has to be there. But donors all have different policies. NGOs all have different policies. If it could get to a point where clusters could be very clear, we've compiled all the evidence and we've made a decision, and this is the best decision because of the information we have. That would be really helpful in being able to tell the donors, no, it's not acceptable to be pushing for this when actually this is better. And the same with the NGOs saying it's not good enough to do that, you have to do this. So I think that would be very helpful. But it needs funding, and I'm not sure where that's going to come from, because the clusters are not funded. So that's...
Okay.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot more burning questions, but we
Don't
have
have
a
time.
second. Yeah, we have a second talk as well, which we would like to give appropriate attention.
Thank you.
Thank you. So our second speaker is Tom Esslemont. He's an investigative journalist working for Thomson Reuters. And prior to becoming a journalist, he worked also with MSF in Kazakhstan, Afghanistan, and has been doing a lot of really interesting journalism on humanitarian issues, as well as kind of migrant issues in Europe, and kind of peacekeeping and sexual exploitation and things like that. So we're really excited he's here tonight, and he'll be talking specifically about what the role of journalism is within kind of war zones and humanitarian crisis, considering kind of the social media, the different roles that NGOs play in communicating information, as well as citizens with access to mobile devices, and it completely changes the dynamics. So that's what Tom is going to talk to us about. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Selma. It's great to be here back at RedR. In fact, my career began at RedR in 2001. In fact, I worked in the old RedR office in the Institute of Mechanical Engineers next door, so it's great to be back. And I've been on a bit of a journey since then, as Selma mentioned, working for MSF for a couple of years in different contexts, humanitarian contexts, war, refugee contexts, tuberculosis, crisis in Kazakhstan, and then in Afghanistan. And it was during that time really that I remember very clearly, it was, I suppose, at the dawning of the modern digital internet age, trying desperately hard to get information and stories about what we were doing as MSF relief workers, aid workers. I was a logistician, but we were all doubling up as communications officers as well, I suppose, to get that information and to get those stories out to the wider world. And back then it was very difficult. We had a satellite phone and radio and not much else. There was very little internet, and how much the world has changed. I went on to become a journalist. I worked for the BBC for 10 years, and now I'm with the Thomson Reuters Foundation. We're a part of the Reuters news agency, and we cover these humanitarian crises day in, day out. And really what I wanted to talk to you about, and also hear your thoughts on afterwards, is to what extent journalists can be useful, can they, and to what extent aid workers can be helpful, relief workers, development workers can be helpful in providing information and collaborating on the coverage of these crises. And I'd really like to hear from you as well about whether or not this is a fruitful relationship, or to what extent it can be improved. So I don't have a particularly curated slideshow, but just a few ideas which I hope will annotate some of the thoughts that I've got. And the first point, I suppose, that is endlessly stressed and endlessly apparent to me as a journalist, traveling to parts of Europe to cover the refugee crisis and migrant crisis, to Africa to look at that same crisis at its root, or to look at other humanitarian issues, is the access that we get as journalists to those disasters, to those problems.
And we're incredibly lucky and privileged to get that access as a result of working with humanitarian agencies. Now, I've chosen this particular slide at the start. It's a Vice News video showing what it was like inside a rescue boat in the Mediterranean, I think, sometime last year. And basically, it's got the Vice News label on it. It was done by a Vice News reporter, but they're on board an MSF boat, and they wouldn't have had that access were it not for MSF. And I suppose I'm really just using that as a perfect illustration. This comes from the MSF website of how the relationship is symbiotic. MSF is able to put that video up on its website and demonstrate, the incredible work that it's doing. Vice News gets the credit as well. The next point, though, as well, is that we are, as journalists covering this particular area, heavily reliant on the data and the information that we get from relief agencies. Now, it's another MSF slide. I'm not particularly sorry about the bias here. This is not any particular reason other than I was just looking for something that covered this in a nutshell. MSF, other agencies, many other agencies, Oxfam, UNICEF, all the UN agencies, every humanitarian organisation is providing us with the data and the information which we then feed into our stories. The point is, I suppose, with the explosion and the proliferation of social media, is that, as you all know, it's often the aid workers who are there first. The journalists then arrive second. So, our first inkling of just how big a disaster or a crisis or a problem is comes from aid agencies. Very often, of course, it can work the other way around as well. And we are all at the mercy then of the social media that we use to deliver that information. And this is obviously a tweet just from September, this month, in fact, showing the numbers rescued on a particular boat. But I think our role as journalists is obviously to challenge that information, particularly mine as an investigative reporter, to not take at face value all the numbers that we get. I was trying to think of different examples. There are so many that we have where the original figure is not quite right, the original death toll or the number of people arriving in a particular boat is not quite right. So often we have to take into account what many different agencies are saying. But certainly, again, we're incredibly grateful for that information. But our job as journalists is, I believe, to challenge it or to make sure that we are reflecting on the wide variety of different information available. And the point that I'm making with all of these, with this whole talk really, is that I believe, despite the fact that we live in this context of social media where we can all be citizen journalists wherever we are, we still need journalists, professional journalists, to convert or to translate what's going on into some kind of format, whether it's video, audio, some kind of social media format, or just text, which can give us the additional perspective on these crises. But I'd like to hear your thoughts on that as well. So this point, the next point really, is to again illustrate the data side of things, how much we are reliant on humanitarian agencies. This a photo from a very recent bombing in Syria. Not quite sure which one, but these are the white helmets. It's just a picture from their Twitter feed. And this particular tweet referring to that awful Aleppo airstrike the other day. And again, they are the first responders. They're the first ones on the ground, and often we're quick to look at what the white helmets are saying, and we might try to get some comment from them to reflect into our stories. So we're, again, reliant. But this quote from the same day actually came from an interview which a journalist for Reuters did. And it started with an hour of extremely fierce bombing. Now I can hear the sound of helicopters overhead. The last two were barrel bombs. So a journalist picked up the phone, used one of their contacts in their contacts book and was able to get a quote. Now, I would love to show you the entire story that Reuters wrote about the airstrike on that humanitarian convoy. Don't have the time to do that. But what I wanted to show you was that, yes, we can get a lot from social media. You can get that constant feed. But as journalists, we should be going that extra mile. We should be getting the quotes from the officials, the aid workers, the civilians, the hospital workers, everyone, and try to build that balanced picture. And of course, we also have to, in many ways, reflect both sides of the story, or however many sides of the story that there are. So essentially, we can get a lot of access, we can get a lot of data and information from aid agencies, and we can also get more depth and understanding by spending time with the likes of you, Red R members, or anyone who's in the field. But we have to go there ourselves. And that's what I've been able to do in my career. I'm extremely fortunate, I think, to have been to lots of places and seen things at first hand. This is the Central African Republic. I was there last year, and I went there to cover a number of stories. There's obviously been a huge humanitarian crisis ongoing as a result of the political instability and the conflict there. This photo was taken in Bombari, which is the second city in the Central African Republic. It's not really a city, it's a tiny town. It's a collection of camps for displaced people. And I went there because there had already been a number of reports of sexual abuse of civilians by UN workers, peacekeepers in this case, and by French military Songaris troops. So I wanted to kind of understand a bit more about the context. We were hearing a lot from Human Rights Watch and aid agencies who had collected information about the victims of that abuse. Now, no one in this picture had any bearing or relevance in the particular story I ended up writing. They're just there the particular day a UN worker happened to visit. But by going there, I was able to find out that actually, in addition to the abuse cases, there was also an awful lot of promiscuity and fraternization between the UN peacekeepers, the Congolese battalion in this particular town, and the local women who were effectively being used as prostitutes, and to write a story about that. But I suppose I wanted to mention this example as sort of bleak and horrible as it is, because really it was only by going there that I was able to get that story and to investigate. And to also understand that some members of this Congolese battalion, not necessarily ones you see here, were clearly wandering out of their camp and committing these abuses because no one was keeping them in line. They had actually ended up a couple of months later being sent home as a result of this this systemic problem, and also as a result of the fact they'd been there quite clearly too long. They'd been there a year longer than they should have been, and were worn out and unfit for being there in the first place. So before I move on to this picture, I suppose the particular lessons that I've got from this travel and from that particular trip and others is that we can have a tremendous impact collectively, aid workers, aid agencies, journalists, through the stories that we tell. And we're under tremendous pressure as journalists these days to achieve that sort of impact, to bring about some sort of change, whether it's a political decision or to influence a political debate in a country, or in this case to get the UN to take tougher action, which I think is worthwhile and does have its benefits. I also think would caution that sometimes perhaps our role as journalists ought to be to tell the story and to not necessarily seek to have that impact. But of course, sometimes we really need to hold people to account. And And I suppose accountability is at the very essence of this particular story. And one of the reasons why I would again argue that journalists are necessary, and I suppose I'm someone who's seen it from both points of view, aid worker and journalist, is because we can hold to account aid agencies. We can double check what is being done, and particularly in this era of transparency and accountability, ensure that efforts that agencies that you are making in the field to make sure that your work is accountable are reflected in the media, and also to pick up on areas where there is that lack of accountability. And that's something that's very difficult to do sometimes when there isn't the information, there isn't the data. But again, we're always grateful for this sharing of information that continues to go on. And I suppose Haiti is one particular example of where that sharing of information worked quite well. It was really as a result of what was being said on social media in 2010 that allowed the cholera epidemic to be broken. I'm not really sure who got the scoop in the end. Of course, brought into the country into Haiti by the UN, but also that the pattern of the epidemic was able to be mapped. And I wanted to show you one article which I forgot to put up in the slideshow, but there was the epidemic was mapped as a result of social media. Some academics were able to trace the particular parts of the settlements where cholera was breaking out because of what aid workers were saying and what civilians were saying in social media and in other ways as well. But I think it's just a kind of lasting image of how shocking and abhorrent such situations are. But just to kind of end, what I wanted to say was, I think, to summarize, we're, as I said, at the mercy and very much benefit from aid workers for data and information that you share and your stories and insight. And as a result of that, we get incredible and powerful human tales of what's going on in the humanitarian context. We're also very, we depend a lot, I think, on aid agencies as journalists for contacts. But I also want to say that I think we can be a vehicle, I think the media can still be a vehicle for your stories. What's happened in the last decade is websites and social media have exploded, allowing stories to be told in so many different areas that whereas in the past it might have just been on news websites. These days it can be on the websites of aid agencies themselves, of charities and organisations themselves. But I still think that we journalists have a role to play, and vital that we continue to maintain your trust and everyone's trust in what we do. So, thank you very much.